Scott Robertson's time in charge of the All Blacks may have ended abruptly, but his future in Test rugby is far from settled. In fact, new details surrounding his exit from New Zealand Rugby, NZR, suggest the former Crusader Supremo could be back in the international arena far sooner than many initially believed, and potentially with another Tier 1 nation before the year is out. Robertson, 51, was relieved of his duties last month following what New Zealand Rugby described as a mixed two-year tenure in charge of the three-time world champions. While his appointment had been greeted with widespread optimism after a record-breaking spell with the Crusaders, his transition from Super Rugby dominance to the unforgiving demands of Test rugby proved far less smooth as part of his separation agreement. NZR confirmed that Robertson would face restrictions on where he could work for a defined period. At the time, those comments appeared to shut the door firmly on any immediate return to international coaching, particularly with a rival nation. He has some constraints on who he can work for, and that lasts for a period, NZ Rugby chair David Kirk said when addressing the media. There are a number of international countries, mostly the top Tier 1 countries, for about a year. On the surface, the implication was clear. Robertson would not be permitted to take charge of another major rugby nation, particularly one that could pose a direct competitive threat to the All Blacks, until at least 12 months had elapsed. However, a fresh report from the New Zealand Herald has cast that assumption into serious doubt that a clause with a loophole. According to the Herald, Robertson's contract contains a subtle but significant loophole. While NZR had previously indicated that he would be barred from working with Tier 1 nations for a year, the report claims that Robertson may, in fact, be free to coach those very countries once New Zealand have already faced them in 2026. The outlet states that, despite previous comment from NZR, Robertson can start coaching other nations once the All Blacks have played them this year. If accurate, it fundamentally alters the landscape of Robertson's immediate future. Rather than being sidelined from Test rugby until 2027, he could theoretically accept a role, either as head coach or assistant, with another major nation later this year, provided New Zealand have already played them. The timing of that clause is particularly intriguing given the introduction of the new Nations Championship, which will see the All Blacks face almost every leading rugby nation over the course of the calendar year. In previous seasons, New Zealand would typically host one Northern Hemisphere opponent during the July window, with tours often limited to a single Test series. Under the revised global calendar, that is no longer the case. A crowded 2026 Test schedule. The All Blacks 2026 campaign begins with a blockbuster clash against France, before back-to-back tests against Italy and Ireland in the same mid-year window. Those fixtures alone could open 3 potential doors for Robertson almost immediately. Once New Zealand have completed those matches, the contractual restriction would, in theory, no longer apply to those specific nations. That raises the remarkable prospect of Robertson joining a rival Test side within weeks of facing his former team. France and Ireland, in particular, stand out as fascinating possibilities. Fabien Galthy remains under scrutiny in France despite Les Blues' undeniable talent, while Andy Farrell's Ireland, though still among the world's elite, have faced growing questions around their ability to convert dominance into silverware on the biggest stages. Neither union is expected to make a knee-jerk decision mid-season, but Robertson's availability would give both the FFR and IRFU an experienced, innovative contingency option should pressure intensify. Even if a head coaching role feels unlikely in the short term, an assistant position, particularly one focused on attack or high-performance systems, could prove attractive to both parties. Yet while France and Ireland are intriguing hypotheticals, it is another Six Nations nation that has emerged as the most realistic and closely watched destination. Scotland enter the frame. Scotland's position has come under sharp focus following their shock 18-15 defeat to Italy in Rome at the weekend, a result that has reignited long-standing doubts over Gregor Townsend's tenure. Townsend entered the 2026 Six Nations knowing it was likely to be a defining tournament for his future. Despite flashes of brilliance over the years, Scotland have consistently struggled to turn potential into sustained success, particularly against the elite sides in the championship. The loss to Italy, widely regarded as one of the most disappointing results of Townsend's reign, has only intensified scrutiny. For many observers, it already felt like a make-or-break campaign. After one round, the head coach is firmly on the back foot. If a Six Nations coach were to depart before the end of the tournament or immediately afterward, Townsend appears the most vulnerable. However, the timing of Scotland's test calendar complicates matters. The All Blacks do not face Scotland until November, which would mean Robertson, under the reported clause, could not take up a role with the Scottish Rugby Union until late in the year. That is a long wait for a union potentially looking to reset its direction sooner rather than later. Interim solutions and internal options should Scotland opt for change following the Six Nations, an interim solution would likely be required. Fortunately for the SRU, they have a compelling option already in place. Glasgow Warriors head coach Franco Smith has emerged as a leading internal candidate. The South African has transformed Glasgow into one of the most dynamic and resilient sides in the United Rugby Championship, earning widespread praise for his tactical acumen and player development. Smith has long harbored ambitions of returning to Test rugby and was widely tipped as a potential successor to Townsend following the Rugby World Cup. If the SRU decide to act earlier, he would almost certainly be the frontrunner for the role. That does not necessarily rule out Robertson, however. A scenario in which Smith takes charge on an interim or medium-term basis, with Robertson joining later, either as a long-term head coach or as part of a revamped coaching ticket, cannot be discounted. Given Robertson's pedigree, global reputation, and experience at the highest level, Scotland would be remiss not to explore every possible avenue. The bigger picture ultimately, a post-World Cup appointment still feels like the cleanest and most logical option for all parties involved. For Robertson, it would allow time to reset, reflect on the lessons of his All Blacks tenure, and re-enter the Test arena under more favorable circumstances. For unions considering change, it provides clarity and stability during a critical cycle in the international game. Yet rugby rarely unfolds in neat timelines. Pressure, politics, and performance often accelerate decisions, and Robertson's unique contractual situation means opportunities could arise sooner than expected, even if only in an assistant or advisory capacity. What is clear is that Scott Robertson's Test coaching story is far from over. Whether in Europe, the Southern Hemisphere, or back in Super Rugby before another international leap, his expertise remains in demand. And as unions weigh their options in an increasingly competitive global landscape, the availability of a proven winner, even one coming off a turbulent stint with the All Blacks, is something few can afford to ignore. For Scotland in particular, it may be a door worth keeping firmly ajar.